Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Betsy Broun. I'm the director of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and thrilled to be convening this fabulous conference that we've been looking forward to for such a long time. It couldn't be a more important topic and a more timely one for us and for the world at large. Of course, in every aspect of our lives, political, social, economic, whatever, we find ourselves more interconnected and global than ever before. And here at the Smithsonian, we have decided to focus very emphatically on this aspect. The Smithsonian, at every level, from the secretary throughout every employee, and including the Board of Regents and advisory boards, have all just engaged in a year-long strategic planning initiative. We've come up with 4 great goals, and 2 of those are directly relevant to today. One is valuing world cultures, and the other is understanding the American experience. And I think this particular conference really deals with both extremely directly. So we hope that this is, I was going to say the first, but it's actually the second big conference that has been organized here for the purpose of raising these deep fundamental issues, and we hope to do many more. The collections at our museum are very rich, and actually in the area of Asian and Pacific Island cultural interactions, significantly unexplored. I feel as if this is a field where there is a great deal yet to do. Anything as simple as the Theodore Voorhees painting that you see on the screen that's been used thematically for this conference, to the fact that we have just acquired the entire estate archive from the Namjoon Paik estate. Certainly an artist who was global in every way, came from South Korea, lived briefly in Japan, lived in Germany, made a career in America, and maintained contacts all across that area. I gather a few of you toured a room with John Hanhart and saw some of the artworks in the museum. As we're discovering what's in the archive, it's dazzling. He might write in 3 or 4 different languages on a single sheet of notepaper. It's going to take a lot of thinking and sorting out to really understand the depth and complexity of someone like Paik, who was living every day with a kind of interconnected global awareness in a way that many of us, at least I, have not. I know some of the rest of you had a tour of the William Wiley exhibition upstairs, and it opens to the public tomorrow. We invite everybody to go to see it. He is someone who, would never have made art of that type without a deep awareness of Buddhism, of Asian cultures. It's a little too simplistic to talk just in terms of a linear influence. He's someone who really absorbed ideas, transformed them, worked very profoundly with them, but living as he did on the far left coast, he was particularly exposed and sensitive, and I think it shows in that beautiful exhibition that I hope all of you will see. We're very excited that it travels to the Berkeley Museum after it concludes here. We've long been a center for American art scholarship. The fellowship program was begun under Director Joshua Taylor decades ago and has hosted lots and lots of research fellows over many, many years. Increasingly, they are coming to us from other countries, and we're especially happy to have Terra Foundation's support to offer opportunities to scholars and their publications that simply didn't exist a decade or 2 ago. Similarly, the journal has been very open to, our academic journal, which appears 3 times a year, has been very open to contributions from scholars from abroad. We encourage that. Our research databases often record American art in foreign collections, and in our exhibitions and every other part of our program, there is a desire to find these connections and relationships and explore them in greater depth. As part of that, of course, we are overjoyed that the Terra Foundation is supporting today's conference. The foundation has not only paid for the organizational expenses, but made it possible to bring speakers from China, Japan, Korea, England, and Ireland, And I understand many of our academic speakers also have been able to bring students with them. So it's a wonderful exchange and occasion to interact, and we hope just the first of many. I want to personally thank Liz Glassman for all she has done, as well as Charles Eldridge, who I think is appearing here today in a double starring role as a Terra Foundation trustee and also as my predecessor as director of this museum. We have Wanda Korn. She too has a double role as a Terra trustee and a former commissioner of this museum. And okay, they're both also great scholars of American art. So it feels particularly good to have them back again. Obviously, the discussions are different from what they were even 10 and 15, much less 20 or 30 years ago. When I was studying art, we would occasionally trace a linear influence, from one artist in one country on another artist in another country. But today, it's really all about sites of encounter, arenas of contact, a more fertile and multiple kind of cross-encounter. It's a very different kind of conversation. I think it's a more complicated one. It's more about shades of gray instead of black and white. It allows us to sort of go back and look again at ideas that we thought we had sort of received, like how did opening up Japan affect Western art? All of those ideas were perhaps understood too simplistically in the past and need to be looked at again. We want to put the tumult back in the relationship. What emerges is really a transnational world. But I think even the biologists who study global biodiversity tell us that you can't study a global enterprise without having a lens on which to view it. And if you're studying diverse populations, you have to study them in the context of their habitat. And so this ability to balance a inspired localism that opens up onto a larger world is difficult to juggle, but I think we're newly aware, both in the sciences and the humanities, of how important that is to understand zones of contact. I want to particularly thank, for the inspiration of doing this, Cindy Mills and Amelia Gerlitz. So would you just stand up wherever you are and stay standing for a minute? We have sort of an academic team at the museum, and they are not the sole academic team, but they're two of the great pillars of it. Cindy is the editor of our distinguished journal. Amelia oversees our fellowship program. And they, in the spirit of collaboration, worked closely with two others. Lee Glazer, Lee, would you stand up, please, of the Sackler, our colleagues in the Asian Museums of the Smithsonian, and also Franklin Odo. Is he here? Franklin, who heads the... Not yet. Well, in absentia, we honor Franklin, who is head of the Asian Pacific American program at the Smithsonian. So big thanks. We want to have everybody stand so we can point to them and say, this is a great collaboration. Anthony Lee is going to moderate our discussions this afternoon. He'll do introductions of speakers, which will be brief because I think you have already a background on each speaker in your packet. And I might just mention, in the sort of heartwarming way that things come full circle, we're very pleased that he was, 3 or 4 years ago, the winner of our Charles C. Eldridge Prize for Distinguished Scholarship, named in honor of Charlie. And I think he will be able to give us terrific insights along the way, a really wise man. Finally, I invite you all to come back next March when we will debut at the Renwick Gallery a show called The Art of Gaman, which is an exhibition that first appeared on the West Coast and is now going to come to Washington. It is craft objects and decorative objects, everything from jewelry to furniture, that was produced by Japanese Americans in the internment camps. It certainly is a show that talks about the incredible ability to create under adverse circumstances And it certainly gives a whole new idea to valuing world cultures and understanding American experience. So please come back often, and thank you very much for coming today and tomorrow.
Hello, I'm Amelia Gerlitz of the American Art Museum, co-organizer of today's symposium. I'm delighted to introduce Alexandra Munroe, Senior Curator of Asian Art at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. She recently organized the exhibition entitled The Third Mind, American Artists Contemplate Asia, 1860 to 1989. And she will talk with us today about her experience in curating this ambitious and thought-provoking show. We'd also very much like to thank the Guggenheim Museum for sending a number of the exhibition catalogs to us to hand out to our symposium attendees. I hope you all were able to get one from our lobby, so thank you very much. And Alexandra.
Thank you, Betsy and Cindy and Amelia, for this wonderful opportunity to address so many close colleagues of mine who were actually with me for the last 10 years during the inception of this project. As you all know, The Third Mind was, of course, a large-scale exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum, also a scholarly book. That indeed one of our funders, the U.S. Japan Foundation, has made available to all of you today. It was a series of, it was a website, an interactive website that actually has a lot of material that is not found in the book on it. It remains live, that website, so I encourage you and your students to visit it. It's basically constructed around the chronology of the book, but has a number of texts and links embedded in it, which I think is very useful and rich. So please consult that and exploit it. It was also a series of live performances that were an integral part of the performance element of the exhibition. That was technically the final section of the show that we took into live time, that we took into, indeed, the spaces of the museum. This is a work by Meredith Monk, Ascension Variations, that she performed using the entire Guggenheim Rotunda and many of the exhibition galleries around the show. It was all organized by the Guggenheim Museum and presented there in winter and early spring of 2009. And of course, the realization of all of these components would not have been possible without the support, advice, and collaboration of literally hundreds of colleagues within and beyond the museum. And I especially just want to take a moment to acknowledge my colleague Vivian Green, curator of 19th and early 20th century art at the Guggenheim Museum, who curated the opening section on aestheticism and Japan. My research associate Ikuyo Nakagawa, and members of our academic advisory committee that was funded by our lead sponsor, the National Endowment for Humanities. And many of you are here today either presenting or attending. And they contributed, all of these individuals and fine scholars and curators, to the conceptual and theoretical framework of my research. Ultimately, I take the blame for the show, and the curatorial selection process of artists as well as objects, and were instrumental through this process in framing my approach to the subject. I too want to acknowledge the Terra Foundation, not only for a very important grant that helped us realize the enormous scale of the show and the scholarship, but also for the critical input that Liz and Wanda gave at all stages of the show's development. The Third Mind explored a set of ideas around the problematic concept of Asian influence. We shaped the story as a cultural, intellectual, and political history of how select ideas were mediated, interpreted, and used by artists. And within a very rigorous geopolitical historical frame, we built our narrative around the role that literature played in this mediation. and the art historical narrative throughout the show and the book elucidates the key texts and writers with whom artists learned whom artists learned most from. So throughout our period, translations, commentaries, and adaptations of Asian philosophy, metaphysics, poetry, and aesthetics, sacred texts, composed by such towering figures as Ananda Kentesh Kumaraswamy, Arthur Wesley Dow, Fenollosa, Jung, Suzuki, Thoreau, Arthur Waley, Nancy Wilson Ross, Gary Snyder, were widely used, consumed, devoured by artists. And artists' encounters with these key figures, either through a friendship, a master-disciple relationship, either imagined or real, or simply through their writings, are really a centerpiece of this project's narrative and the thesis that we build. And the patterns of this essentially intellectual history are suggested in Ikuyo Nakagawa's chronology and the bibliography compiled for the book. And the third mind uses these texts as the primary point of artists' encounters and writers' encounters with Asia. Asian readings also provided artists with a logic of political resistance to counter what they perceived as the West's moral and spiritual decline over the course of the late 19th and throughout the 20th century. Thomas Merton, writing on the Bhagavad Gita more than 100 years after Thoreau, claimed, "It brings to the West a salutary reminder that our highly activistic and one-sided culture is faced with a crisis that may end in self-destruction because it lacks an authentic metaphysical consciousness. Without such depth, our moral and political protestations are just so much verbiage." The result is that the third mind was never about Asia. Rather, it illuminated the range of approaches that artists and writers used to collect ideas for their creative strategies and to interrogate and critique their own conditioned worldviews. This last point is critical and offers a first threshold for deeper examination for all of you to take, which is namely how to elaborate on how artists used the East, the construction of Asia, as a critique of the West, or more specifically, as a critique of America, in what amounts it often as a subversive alliance with the object of what was perceived as American imperialism, either in the Pacific area where America projected most of its political power, and more widely across Asia as a whole. Well, no one has faulted the third mind for its lack of ambition. The project aimed high, to trace how the art, literature, and philosophy of Asia were transmitted, received, and transformed within American cultural and intellectual currents, influencing, we claimed, the articulation of new visual and conceptual languages. Featuring some 270 works from over 120 lenders, well over 100 artists. I was too afraid to count how many in the end, but it's well over 100. The show and its complementary programs explored how American art evolved through this process of appropriation and integration of Asian sources that developed from, we locate, about the 1860s through the 1980s, when globalization, we argue, came to eclipse earlier, more deliberate modes of cultural transmission and reception. Of course, the main argument is that while Europe had long been recognized as the font of mainstream American art movements, we presented an alternative lineage of creative culture that, again, is aligned with America's Pacific aspect, Asia. The title which everyone got confused with the third eye, refers to a cut-ups work by the beat writers William Burroughs and Brian Gysin, whose cult of spontaneity in art and life drew direct inspiration from Asian attitudes. This manuscript, which was on display in our Buddhism and the Neo-Avant-Garde section, is composed of random texts and images that evoke, I felt, in a rather poetic license, this methodology of the Burroughs and Gysin evokes an eclectic and purposeful method by which American artists broadly often appropriated material from Asia to create new forms, structures, and meanings in their own work. Misreadings, mediations, denials, imaginary projections, flat-out inventions emerge as important iterations of this creative process. Some artists identified with non-Western art and thought precisely, as I mentioned earlier, to subvert and critique what they saw as the spiritually bankrupt capitalist West. Others culled alternative East-West identities from transcendentalism, theosophy, Jung's aspirations of the collective unconscious, which were all the rage for much of the early 20th century. A little bit later, the New Age movements, preaching the perennial vitality of Asia's spiritual psychology in a global age. Still others simply extracted and freely enlisted whatever served their particular artistic impulses. Grounded in documentary evidence of the artist's encounters with Asia, which was the criterion for admission into our new history, this exhibition showed how artists working across America adopted Eastern ideas and art forms, not only to create new styles of art, but more importantly, a new theoretical definition of the contemplative experience and self-transformative role of art itself, beautifully exemplified in our opening work of James Lee Byers, The Death of James Lee Byers. I have gotten criticism for being too artist-centric. I think that could be a subject of discussion later on, Anthony. I will defend it. Critics were unanimous that the show was long overdue. They were less convinced by its unwieldy or unmanageable scale. The public, however, was undaunted, bless them. They came, and we had an unprecedented number of return visitors. Up to 5 times visitors came back to the show. Although it spanned 120 years and was installed across 25,000 square feet of the Guggenheim Museum's Rotunda and Annex galleries, the Third Mind never pretended to be, and certainly did not achieve to be, comprehensive, exhaustive, or definitive. Exhibitions are defined by the spaces they occupy, something that academics and certainly art critics tend to forget. And decisions for what to include are subject to a variety of variable conditions, some of them frighteningly arbitrary. Hundreds more artists could have been included and weren't, because we knew that encyclopedias don't make good shows. Early on, we decided that architecture, design, ceramics, fashion, and popular art lay beyond this project's scope, while the Asian influence on such influential artists such as Whistler, Lafarge, Dow, Pound, Toby, Graves, of course John Cage, Kerouac and Ginsberg, Reinhardt, Agnes Martin, Adrian Piper, have been extremely well documented and treated in previous studies. The Third Mind was really the first to argue that this influence was not occasional or eccentric, but was rather a continuous and complex undercurrent that courses through the development of early modern to post-war, to neo-avant-garde, and indeed to contemporary avant-garde art practices in the United States. That the nature of the artist's work within these forces varied widely, and that Asia meant all kinds of different things to different artists at different periods, should not discourage our critical and historical analysis of this profound lineage of ideas, events, and people, which in the end we only scraped the surface of. Opening, I'm now going to give you a quick walkthrough for those who didn't see the show. We opened with the late 19th century aesthetic movement and coursed through the 20th century following very distinct movements and very distinct ideas within the development of abstract art, primarily painting and some photography, conceptual art, minimalism, and the neo-avant-garde, as they unfolded both on the East Coast, obviously primarily around Boston and New York, and very, very importantly for us, the West Coast, which was really a big focus of our research from the start. It also presented select developments in modern poetry, music, and dance theater, both live and represented in the exhibition experience. It was organized chronologically and thematically, and each of the show's 7 sections explored interconnected collectives of artists who we discovered shared specific aesthetic strategies and rhetoric derived from the Asian sources that they were reading over a given time, and which we argue shaped their conceptual approach to art making. It's not what the art looked like. It's not that this looks Asian, but that it feels what Asian as we defined that Asian feeling. The accompanying book follows this chronological, or I should say as artists defined Asian feeling. The accompanying book follows this chronological structure with chapters by a range of scholars that correspond to the show's structure and section titles. And these are, as I said, the 19th century, late 19th century aestheticism and Japan, opening, of course, with St. Gaudens's fabulous memorial sculpture. And of course, Whistler, Cassatt. We also had in this then section 2, which is in this same gallery, off the rotunda, landscapes of the mind, new conceptions of nature, which followed the school around Arthur Wesley Dove, an artist who emerged both in New York under his influence, Stieglitz's circle, and also early followers and consumers of Kandinsky's theosophical readings on the spiritual and abstract art, which of course indirectly and directly were based on his ideas of, and the theosophist's ideas of tantric cosmograms as, and their abstractions as doors to a vibrational reality of art and thought, and art as essentially experiential and conceptual. Dow emerges as a very critical figure for us, both, I mean, less so as an artist, but much more so as a writer and thinker and, of course, teacher. This was one of our favorite objects in the show, thanks to generous loans from Washington. Section 3 was a small section, but very potent section, focused on Ezra Pound, modern poetry, and dance theater. Focused on Ezra Pound's relationship with, through Fenollosa's widow, to the writings that Fenollosa had completed late in his life, early translations of Libor, and also translations of early no plays that we argue really become the foundation for Anglo-American modern literature. And linked to that circle is Martha Graham and her relationship with Noguchi and others. Section 4, which Bert Winter helped a lot on, abstract art, calligraphy, and metaphysics, the Asian dimension in this hotly contested centerpiece of American post-war art, abstract expressionism, and its related manifestation of what we call metaphysical abstraction. Also linking a calligraphy and the calligraphic gesture to sculpture and painting. Some critics accuse me of cherry picking, so I cherry picked. Section 5, Buddhism and the Neo-Avant-Garde, focusing on what we called cage Zen, beat Zen, and Zen in a sort of tongue-in-cheek reference to Alan Watts's important critique of Zen and the American avant-garde, published in the early 1950s. Focusing on Fluxus and a number of the artists in the cage circle, the pop artists who we kind of rescued from an overly pop interpretation and realigned Rauschenberg and Johns to their friendship and long collaboration with Cage and also Cunningham. And the West Coast group, including William Wiley, West Coast conceptualist, Paul Koss, were very instrumental and important to this section, as was Warhol, Sleep. Section 6, the art of perceptual experience, pure abstraction and ecstatic minimalism, that actually opened with Lamont Young and Marianne Zazila's Dream House, which I'll talk about in a moment, and started with Ad Reinhardt and moved through what we call, or what Irwin calls, the art of perceptual experience. And ending in the final section, experiential performance art, which included a site-specific commission by the installation artist Anne Hamilton, that many of you saw, as well as videos by Linda Montano, Bill Viola, and an extraordinary final room of a one-year performance by the Taiwanese-American artist Tekchin Xie. That was a quick run-through. Critics noted the importance of West Coast artists and avant-garde centers in the Third Mind. And this was no coincidence, as the Pacific Coast, as I mentioned, was a focus of my research from the very start. One such center, of course, was Berkeley in the late 1950s, where Lamont Young emerged as an originator of minimal music, with compositions based on a series of long, sustained tones set in unique harmonic language. And as early as 1958, Young analyzed the slow tempo structures of classical Japanese gagaku orchestration, as well as the drone harmonics found in Hindustani raga vocal styles and tambura tuning, and then applied these ideas and practices to his own investigation into the tuning system that he called very revolutionary, in a very revolutionary way, just intonation. Classical Indian musical concepts of svara, which defined the entire dimension of a pitch and its potential psychic effect on the listener, and tala, which is the organization of cyclical structures that facilitate improvisation, reinforced Young's concern for pure intonation and expanded unfolding of time and organically evolving improvisational techniques. Of course, Coltrane was also absolutely engaged in these exact ideas at this exact time. And the effect of those for jazz music is history we all know well. In '62, Young formed a group later called the Theater of Eternal Music, whose first members were Terry Riley and his partner and later wife, Marianne Zazila. They became, in turn, the three of them, disciples of and collaborated with the master Hindustani raga vocalist Pandit Pran Nath from 1970 until Pran Nath's death in 1996. And they often evoke Pran Nath's main teaching that you are the sound is in you. The concept of a work that was eternal led Young and Zazila to evolve this dream house, which is a continuous electronic sound environment in luminous fields of colored light. And working closely with the artists and their sound and light engineers, the Guggenheim constructed a dream house environment that occupied an entire annex gallery space of some 4,000 square feet, which we positioned squarely between the Cage Zen section and minimalism. where it historically belongs. Zazila's work uses these intense light focused through these diachronic filters projected onto sculptural forms that you see here, these mobiles that alternatively dissolve into the contours and shadows around it. These effects are then integrated into Young's musical environment of these periodic sound waveforms generated by these enormous woofers that we had installed to create a truly all-encompassing immersion in the material of sound. We actually had a warning to the visitors that this installation might alter your psychic state of mind, or would propel you, as Lamont says, into a drone state of mind. Visitors were asked to take their shoes off. Some ran out screaming. Many stayed for a long time, up to hours. And again, we had many return visitors. We also had 3 live performances of the group during the course of the show that was stationed in the Dream House. For critics who identified a lack of Indian influence in the show, I remind them that the arts of sound and poetry were as central to our thesis as the visual art of painting. From Thoreau onwards, India's hold over the American imagination came through its metaphysical poetry, the Vedic texts, and sacred music, raga, both of which are designed to induce a altered state of consciousness. The catalog also examines the influence of Vivekananda and Coomaraswamy in some depth. The imagination of India in American art and culture, which I hope Partha will talk about, and the reasons for its perceived marginalization is definitely one topic that calls for greater research, but it was not entirely overlooked. We fully expected the show to raise debate, even controversy, and we welcome signs that it has begun to stir important questions across disciplines and area studies. I'd like to take the remaining few minutes to respond to some frequently asked questions. Number one is, how is your approach related to Said's Orientalist critique? Aren't you reinforcing Orientalist tropes? Our challenge, indeed, from the beginning, and that we talked about extensively in our NEH Advisory Committee meetings, was how to remain critical of the process of constructing the East as a reductive suit of aesthetic, philosophical, and cultural concepts. And while we all acknowledge the significance of Said's theory and realize how far-reaching it is and has been, its pejorative cast over the entire enterprise of Western studies, commentaries, and creative interpretations of Oriental subjects, we found problematic. Said's focus on the Middle East, a reflection of his Palestinian origin, is only partially relevant to all of South Asia, and in some important regard is entirely irrelevant to East Asia and Southeast Asia, where it was Japan, not the imperialist West, who was really the colonial and held colonial and imperial dominion, and indeed which it most brutally exercised. We looked instead to other writers and critics, sort of post-Said Orientalist scholars, including J.J. Clark, who argued that Western knowledge of the Orient has not always proceeded from cultural antipathy, and that argued that Said's critique does not encompass the romantic or positive attitudes towards the Orient that these encounters quite often produced. And he proposes what he calls an affirmative Orientalism, quote, seeking to show that the West endeavored to integrate Eastern thought into its own intellectual concerns in a manner which, on the face of it, cannot be fully understood in terms of power and domination alone. and for our application of these rich and complex applications of Asian art and thought in modern American art, Clark's argument resonated. Furthermore, those recent works that apply Said's critique to India or China overwhelmingly emphasize 19th and early 20th century literature and really virtually skip over the visual arts. The subject of Orientalism and modern Western art, and in particular American art, we found really has been largely ignored. And finally, and most interestingly to me, his thesis does not engage the influence of Orientalism upon the self-awareness of the very Asians it purports to describe. So we place a lot of emphasis and do a lot of rethinking on the work and legacy of thinkers like Okakura Kakuzo, Vivekananda, and D.T. Suzuki, and others, what Bernard Ferré calls representatives or the practitioners, the theorists of secondary Orientalism. This is a really exciting and important topic. I know that some of you are already working on it. I definitely think it's a very important area for further research and deconstruction. Another question that was often asked was, why is there a bias towards Japan and Zen Buddhism over other regions in Asia? I think there was a lot of assumption that since my own background is primarily Japanese art, Japanese language, that my sort of alignment skewed this reading. Actually, it's not just my reading, it's America's reading. The introduction frames America's encounter with Asia squarely within its geopolitical history as a Pacific power. And 1989, the date, of course, when the Berlin Wall fell, the end of the Cold War, defines, as I mentioned, the historical span of my subject. Within that framework, and within the geopolitical fact of America and its Pacific coast, and the number of wars that America had to enlarge its empire from at least the mid-19th century, economic and political, and to protect its borders during the Pacific War, Japanese and Zen Buddhism dominate in large part because America's political and economic ties with Japan were historically stronger than those even with China and certainly with India, the other prime source nations. Also, as another topic of research, Protestant ethics, which were in vogue, were in power then in America, resonated with Japanese disembodied minimalist aesthetics for the same reasons that they clashed with fleshy manifestations of Hindus, of India's Hindu pantheon. You can just look at what American museums collected during this period to see that very obvious bias. Asian immigration, especially on the West Coast, also characterizes Americans' experience. And for much of the early 19th, much of the 19th and early 20th century, the primary waves of immigrants came to Southern California from China and Japan, not from South Asia, to labor in the mining, railroad, and agricultural developments of the Western frontier. These migrations, as Anthony has showed us, have changed the fabric of American society and nurtured artists' encounters with Asia, including, as Anthony has discussed elsewhere, the number of Japanese and Chinese art teachers in the major art schools in this country. South Asian, or really Indian Pakistani immigration, is a much more recent phenomenon in America's history and would have played a greater role if our scope had extended into the 1990s and the early 2000s. So yes, it's another topic of investigation. Next question. Why was artists' engagement with Islam excluded from your research? This is very simple, and I'm not a scholar of Islam or Islamic culture. I'm working on it, and did not feel equipped to trace its influence in American art. I do think it's a really legitimate and exciting area of inquiry, especially if its scope were expanded to include art of Europe, and because of Europe's colonial history with Islamic culture, which America did not have until recently, that connection is much richer, and a lot more evidence is abundant to substantiate that kind of charting. And if we were also to include artists working in the broad Islamic world, especially the Middle East, and if we were to include contemporary practices, I feel this is a really interesting a line of inquiry that deserves academic and museum study. Finally, last question was why was contemporary excluded? Why were the 1990s excluded from the exhibition? And this is one of those arbitrary things. We ran out of space and money. But then within that framework and in consultation with our advisory group, we realized that there was a kind of important logic for ending the show when we did. All the exhibition artists were born before 1960. For those generations covered in this exhibition and catalog, foreign travel was a self-transformative experience. The artist's process of research was intentionally and deeply internalized. Travel for them was part escape, part enlightenment, and grounded in an Orientalist tradition that taught self-betterment through the selective appropriation of these ideas, practices, relationships, spiritual practices, and material artifacts that represented to them an alternative or superior other in a very dialectic East-West world. After 1990, artists traveled less for this kind of personal research and far more in a global context of art presentation in biennales and other international shows that have proliferated around the globe over the last 2 or 3 decades. And this development has obviously paralleled globalization and the consequent shift in the nature of how knowledge is transmitted, and also, again, the nature of this clear East-West modernist bifurcation, which recent decades have just exploded with new complexities and diversities and vitalities of art practice and thought around the world. So that said, and since you've heard my confession of how we ran out of space, there is indeed an enormous amount of work to be done in sorting out the manifestations of Asian art and culture, including identity politics among Asian Americans, whose numbers really proliferate during the 1990s and since, within the larger context of globalization. Finally, how did the public respond to the show? Some raised concern about how the exhibition contributed or not to the general public's understanding of American art and Asia. In an upcoming issue of the Art Journal, Seth McCormick says that I'm sort of nurturing a superficial understanding of Asia via artists' appropriations. In fact, the Guggenheim hired an expert museum evaluation team, Randy Korn and Associates, to review visitor experiences. The show's total attendance was 210,000 people, or about over 3,000 people a day over 11 weeks, which was a little short due to our 50th anniversary. This report, Randy Korn's report, was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, revealed, in fact, that the majority of visitors were persuaded by how the exhibition, quote, demonstrated Asian influences on American artists, and, quote, understood that this is a new idea or new paradigm in art history, unquote. And according to Randy Korn, these findings are actually extraordinary. Most visitors to most shows don't come away as changed by what they saw. The report states, quote, many of them believed they would look at American art through a slightly different lens as a result of seeing the exhibition. That's what we aim to do. Thank you.